Welcome to Election Bites, bite-sized, election-focused conversations for your lunch hour. Election day was last week, but the election process goes on. This week we are talking about post-election audits, what they are, and what the point is. And we are joined by Monica Childers, who is a civic technologist who focuses on U.S. election administration and policy, working closely with election officials around the country to implement new tools and best practices, and is also a member of the Carter Center's U.S. elections team. Monica, welcome.
Thank you so much, Avery. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, what is the point of a post-election audit? What can they tell us about the election process that just occurred?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, election audits are basically the quality assurance process for elections. Elections are a very human endeavor. You have election officials who are dedicated professionals, but they're also joined by a large staff of temporary workers every election cycle who have to be trained and deployed on a pretty tight schedule. So, we know that things are going to go wrong. That's just sort of a part of elections. And so, election audits are how we go back and make sure that we have the checks and the balances in place to catch anything that might have gone wrong and correct it before the actual election is certified, at which point the totals become final.
So, what's the difference then between an audit and a recount?
Right. So recounts are where we go back and re-examine every ballot. And so not every state does this the same way. In some states, a recount is actually a retabulation, where you might rescan every ballot through the scanners and recount it. In some states, it's a hand recount where they physically look at every paper ballot and go back through and count it. A recount is by design a very time intensive, labor intensive process. So it has a lot of things that go into it, and it means that we can't really do it after every election. It's not a process that can be a standard thing we do. And indeed, in most states, you have a very specific set of circumstances in statute when you can do a recount, and only when those circumstances are met are you able to do a recount. So an audit, since it's a quality assurance process, is something that you want to be able to do after every election as sort of a regular part of your process. And so because of that, it needs to be more lightweight. And we do that by generally looking at a sample of things, not every ballot, but a sample of ballots, not every process that we do in an election, but a sample of the processes that we do in the election, so that you can spot check things and make sure everything went correctly, but it's much more lightweight and able to be a standard part of your process.
So, it sounds like audits are sort of really helpful tools for election administration, and that they're a good practice. Is this a practice that is used across the country? And if not, why not?
Yeah, so there are a number of states that do election audits, and election audits look a little bit different in every state. Almost every state does something. A lot of states will do what we call a traditional post-election audit, where they might go re-examine a specific percentage of precincts or a specific percentage of tabulators that have actually counted the ballots, and go recount those particular ballots. That's good. It tells you if there are any problems with those particular precincts or tabulators, but it doesn't really give you a picture of the full election. In other states, we might do something that's called a compliance audit, and that would look at all the different laws that govern election administration and whether individual jurisdictions have followed those laws. Have they posted all the notices they have to post publicly? Have they gone through and captured all the paperwork that they need to do after every election? Those kinds of things. So it can take a lot of different forms, and most states do something. We're increasingly seeing a number of states move to something called a risk limiting audit, which is a type of audit that checks the post-election tabulation. And that's considered sort of a gold standard for tabulation audits, but that's just one type of audit. And most states do something. In every state, what kind of audit they do is usually governed by what's in their statute. Some states have a lot of flexibility to choose and sort of evolve their audit practices as the best practices, state of the art in the field evolves. And some states are very closely circumscribed on what they can and can't do as their audit. So it varies greatly state to state.
So, after 2020, audits in Arizona by groups like Cyber Ninjas got a lot of attention. What is the difference between that kind of audit and the audits that you're talking about?
Well, one of the things we always try and do in audits is make sure that we have a set procedure that we're following that's the same after every election, and it's the same no matter who's doing the audit. Um, Things like that just ensure that you're not doing an audit for partisan purposes, that you're not looking for a specific outcome. And I think that was one of the major criticisms of the Cyber Ninjas audit, was that it was very clear that they were looking for a particular outcome. They were looking for fraud, and that's never the atmosphere that you want to go into an audit with. You need to go in with an open mind. You also need to go in with bipartisan teams or teams of election officials who are actually trained to do the auditing. Some states use actually their financial auditors and bring them into the process, but folks who are actually trained in elections and know what they're doing or are representing opposite parties, so that you do have that party balance and that assumption of impartiality when you go into it. Again, having an audit run by folks who are largely all of the same mind and are looking for a particular outcome to benefit a particular side, that doesn't really guarantee you a fair audit. So things like consistent processes, things like having bipartisan teams working on the audit, making sure that you are releasing all the data about the audit publicly. So everything that you do and all the source data that you're examining should also be available and transparent to the public, either for observers or actually posting the data online so other folks can come in after the fact and see it. And that just ensures that anybody else can check the auditor's work as well, which is just as important. Just like the audits check the election officials' work, somebody should be able to check the auditor's work as well and make sure that they're doing things that are up to standards. So those are the kind of things we look for. And it's not that the impulse to audit is bad. I think it's good that we're looking for more transparency in our elections. We're looking to make sure we see those checks and balances working. All of those are good impulses, but you do need to make sure that you're doing it in accordance with sort of a set of standards that means people can trust it. Because if people can't trust it, there's really no point in auditing.
You mentioned earlier this sort of gold standard of tabulation audits, the risk limiting audit, which is what is used in Georgia. Can you maybe use Georgia as an example to sort of talk about some of the challenges of explaining and educating the public on audits and post-election audits?
Yeah, this is a really hard part of sort of bringing auditing into the light. We've always had audits of one sort or another in elections, but the public knowing about that and becoming increasingly engaged in that is a wonderful thing, but there's a pretty steep learning curve. A lot of the audits rely on statistics, which I don't know about you, but math was never my favorite subject in school. And so when you are trying to explain some pretty complex statistical processes to the public, that often can get difficult to make sure people are understanding what you're talking about. There's also this tendency with audits, we tend to focus on efficiency. We really want audits to be as little work for election officials as possible. We want to make sure they're doing enough work to actually be sure of what they're trying to look at. But we also, again, want it to be a regular part of the process, which means making it as easy to complete as possible for election officials. But this idea of efficiency, sometimes it can be taken too far, and we're increasingly finding that some of these audits are looking at so few ballots that the public writ large is not always sure that you're looking at enough ballots. The math may say you're looking at enough ballots to be sure of the outcome, but whether or not that lives up to public scrutiny just in the public consciousness who may not understand the math is actually a really interesting piece of this. So we're increasingly seeing jurisdictions actually doing more work than they necessarily need to according to the math or the statistics behind the audit, just to make sure that they're looking at enough ballots that the public feels comfortable that they've actually seen what they need to see. So things like that, anytime you take something that's meant to be sort of an internal, wonky, detailed process in elections, and you try and bring it to a public audience, the rubber meets the road, and you really have to start seeing, okay, if we want this process to give people confidence, what's that actually going to take? And it may mean going above and beyond what you strictly have to do. That's also true for transparency. There are lots of things that we can do for transparency, but the best way for someone to experience an audit is in the audit room and coming and watching. And they may not get to see every part of the audit if they come and observe, but being in that room does give people a feeling that they understand what's going on better than any explanation ever will. So that's one of our biggest challenges, is just getting people into these rooms to watch these processes go on, because then they really get a sense of what's happening.
Related to that, so are these processes always open to the public? Are there ways that the public can sort of, as you're sort of suggesting, access this process, learn about the process, get involved?
Yeah, so that differs state by state, whether and how the public can be involved. In general, party observers or party monitors are always parts of these process. Sometimes they're serving on audit boards as the actual auditors. Sometimes they're there as observers. And in some states, the members of the public can actually observe as well. That's obviously a best practice. We want as much public input on these processes as possible and to have the public have a chance to come experience it again, because that's the best way for people to understand what's actually going on. But state to state, the access is limited. Some states will offer a live stream of the process so you can watch from the comfort of your own home. Make a bowl of popcorn and watch the audit. It's usually not that exciting, but that is one way that people can participate as well. So state to state, it differs, but in general, there will be public notices about when these audits are taking place in every state. And so going on your local election official's website or your state website after the election and searching the word audits can tell you if there are things going on in your state that you can look for.
Thanks, Monica, for this overview of audits, which I know are sort of happening this week, next week, in many states around the country. So thank you so much for this overview. Thank you to our viewers for joining us for another Election Bites. And tune in again in a couple of weeks, December 8th, when we will be talking about campaign finance with Jeff Clements from American Promise. Until then, thank you. Thank you, Monica.
Thanks, Avery.